To discuss the situation further, I'm now joined live by journalist and broadcaster Neil Clark. Mr. Clark, how much of the turmoil and violence we're currently seeing in Iraq and Afghanistan directly blamed on NATO intervention?
I think they can all be directly blamed on the NATO interventions, because if we think back at these so-called interventions, then nearly all of them were billed as humanitarian ventures, weren't they? It was NATO, the benign NATO powers led by the United States were going into these countries to liberate the people from these wicked dictators like Saddam Hussein, Mullah Omar or Colonel Gaddafi. And in every instance of these so-called interventions, the result has been death and destruction, has been absolute chaos. In Iraq, a new study said that at least 500,000 people have been killed since the invasion, and it could be even more. So I think that the consequences of these interventions have been anything but humanitarian. They've been war crimes, and I think that for people living in these countries, they've been a nightmare what's happened since these NATO interventions. So I think, yes, NATO is to blame.
You know, every day we hear reports of how many people are being targeted or die in Iraq. It's in the middle of its worst spike of violence in years. Has the war in neighboring Syria further destabilized Iraq?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's no coincidence to me that there's been this huge spike in violence in Iraq since the destabilization of Syria has taken place since 2011, of course, because the US has been helping Islamic terrorists there to try to topple the secular, independently minded government of President Assad. And it's no coincidence that there's been this huge spike in violence in Syria and in Iraq at the same time. Al-Qaeda groups are going from Iraq to Syria, from Syria to Iraq. The whole region is in turmoil because of the United States policies. And this is not a mistake. This is it is a mistake to think it's a mistake, if you like, because whenever the neocons come on to talk about Iraq, and of course they very rarely want to talk about Iraq, they always like to claim that, well, Tony Blair and George Bush wanted well, but they made a few mistakes along the way. That's nonsense. The whole aim of the exercise was to destroy Iraq as a functioning country, to make sure it can never again be a threat to regional powers that the US backs in that region. The same with Syria. So I think this is all deliberate. What we're talking about is a deliberate destruction of independently minded countries in this region.
Well, but these Western powers have been claiming that they're fighting, against international terrorism, and yet they've now supported the rebels in both Libya and Syria. How would you explain that apparent contradiction?
Well, absolutely. I mean, it's the biggest myth in the whole of international relations. The biggest myth is that the United States and its allies are implacably opposed to terrorist groups around the world, and particularly Al-Qaeda and Islamic terrorist groups. They're not. They will use Al-Qaeda and terrorist groups like them to help them to topple secular, independently minded governments like President Assad's in Syria, Gaddafi's in Libya and elsewhere. But they will also use the presence of Al-Qaeda groups in order to intervene in countries where they want regime change as well, like Mali, for example, and in Afghanistan. So, in fact, the West uses Al-Qaeda, uses Islamic groups. They're not implacably opposed to them. That's a great myth. Nobody has done more to boost the rise of Al-Qaeda in the last 20 years than the United States. That's the fact.
And speaking of Al-Qaeda, it seems to be expanding itself as a network, becoming more organized. Is there any way to stop it from getting any bigger from what it is right now?
It goes back to the US. I don't think the US wants to stop it. I think, Al-Qaeda serves a very useful purpose for American foreign policy and for Israel too, and for Saudi Arabia. The fact is that if Al-Qaeda didn't exist, it would have to be invented. It serves an awful lot of good purposes for the United States to push its agenda around the world. And I think there's got to be a sea change in the US. If the US was really serious about Al-Qaeda and wanting to deal with it, they would do. They wouldn't be supporting Al-Qaeda in Syria. They wouldn't be wanting a secular regime in Syria to be toppled. They would be actually supporting President Assad in Syria. They wouldn't have been wanting regime change in Libya, would they? So I think that, to answer your question, the future of Al-Qaeda depends on the US. The US helped create Al-Qaeda and this Islamic terrorism, and it's up to the US to stop it if it really wanted to, but their policies show that they're not really interested in doing that, I'm afraid.
Neil Clark, journalist and broadcaster, they're giving his thoughts on what's happening there in Iraq.